point. It's a pretty yawning gap. For example, close to 9 out of 10 clergy would consider themselves very satisfied with their work, but only 1 in 4 roofers. The proportions are really flipped. So I think where we would come to agreement is that it's probably partly the objective features of the job, whether you have meaningful relationships with the people you're helping or almost none, whether you have autonomy or not.
But I think, again, this gets to the selection problem, which is what kind of person goes into what kind of work and how much of that is driven by their temperament and or their happiness.
So do you think that surly unhappy people decide to become waiters?
I wouldn't say that, but I would say that maybe it's not the first choice always. And as we know with a lot of waiters and servers, they are literally doing it while pursuing something else. I mean, at least in New York, that's the cliche, but in New York, it's certainly often true. In other words, this is not the work I chose to do. You don't end up in the clergy by accident, I don't think.
One would hope not. Like, oops, I checked the wrong box and now I'm a man of the cloth.
How do I get out of this cassock? Okay, so the description that accompanies the survey lists the top and bottom 12 occupations in terms of job satisfaction. It says the most satisfying jobs are mostly professions, including those involving caring for, teaching, and protecting others and creative pursuits. The least satisfying dozen jobs are mostly low-skill, manual, and service occupations, especially involving customer service and food, beverage preparation, and serving. But I feel that there is an elephant in the room we're ignoring, which is you and I, and probably a lot of people who listen to a show like this, are extremely fortunate to have work that is fulfilling and satisfying on one or many levels. But we know from the data that even though the share of people who like their work has increased a little bit over the millennia, it's still not very high. It's something like 40%.
Yeah. I think one of the statistics from the Gallup poll is, are you engaged at work? And the proportion of people who are anywhere close to like, yeah, pretty engaged, it's pretty low. It's definitely south of 50%.
Right. So I think you and I are speaking from a minority position here. And look, this guy, Kevin, who wrote to us, he's getting a PhD in chemical education. So he too is heading for that minority quadrant. But I think it's worth asking for people who don't have that as a feature of their work life, what is the best way to think about the role of happiness in your work? Because many people absolutely do not have the option or the access to work that makes them, quote, happy. So how do you think about the trade-offs? And if your job doesn't make you at least a little bit happy, what's good advice for coping with that?
So the research of Amy Wisniewski at Yale on callings, she looked at the idea that you could approach your work as a job, you could approach your work as a career, you could approach it as a calling, each more meaningful than the last. But one thing that was interesting is that, at least in her research, if you look at, for example, people who are attendants for hospital rooms, not the doctors, not the nurses, there are people who do feel like that work is a calling. And that would probably fall into one of these manual labor categories. So it's not just what the occupation is, but the way you perform your occupation. Some of the same researchers who study callings, including Amy Wisniewski, have done work on what they call job crafting, which is where you don't switch jobs, you craft the job you're already in, and you do things to change your mindset about it. But also, you might take certain features of your job that you hate and then try to like get them swapped out.
Get somebody else to do them. It sounds to me like good advice, although I'm thinking back to my youth. And I have to say, having worked a lot of manual labor, I hated it very much. And it tortured me because I couldn't get my mind to stop hating it. I couldn't turn my mind off from thinking how boring and hard.
You were the bricklayer who was not building the temple of God. You were just the bricklayer.
Yeah, I was just building the outhouse. Your advice would not have resonated with me. And I would say, well, you want me to bring creativity to baling the hay. Like,
yeah, I know that sounds crazy, but like I had a job running the photocopier in the basement of somebody's home office and then taking the photocopies up to the first floor and then going back down again and then making more copies. And there's a little complexity. Sometimes it had to be on green paper and sometimes on yellow and sometimes it was double-sided or, pink and stapled. But not a lot of room for creativity and self-expression. But, okay, it reminded me that sometimes I would be like, okay, I'm going to get up to the top of the stairs and I'm going to do it in 3 seconds.
I have some friends who do New York building and renovation, and they tell me that many people who come to your house or apartment to do things like install shades and minor carpentry, they say that they are all stoned all the time.
Well, that explains a lot about my new house, actually.
But the reason being that it's
so terrible, the job is so terrible that you're self-medicating?
I'm reluctant to say that, but yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I guess the real question that Kevin is asking is, what if there's an occupation that you think would make you happy? As Kevin sounds like he thinks about education or academia, but it has a lot of unhappy people already in it. Do you join anyway and hope that your underlying happiness will carry you through? Or do you say, no way, I'm going into that den of vipers. I'd rather dig ditches or, I guess, join the clergy.
I think that my closest social circle within academia, the people I write papers with, the people I converse with, are, as a group, remarkably happy people who are just wondering how it is that they get paid to do what they do, because they clearly would do it even if they didn't get paid. But I will say this, you really ought to, I think, move toward the people that you feel make your life better. And I think sometimes that means doing a little switching of departments or advisors. I'm not saying this to Kevin's advisor. I'm sure you're great. But if I think about the twists and turns that my own career has taken, there were times where I was like, oh, I'm going to sidle up more to this person because they're happy and productive, and spend a little less time with this other person who is not a very happy person and kind of a buzzkill.
Sounds like you hang out with a circle within academia that is a lot like you, and that Kevin has somehow intersected with a totally different circle.
Even though he's in Iowa, where I thought everybody was happy and nice. Is that not true about Iowa? Isn't that true of generally the whole Midwest? Well, at least nice. I don't know about happy.
It sounds like you really took that advice that they now give 4- and 5-year-old kids in school. I don't know if they gave it when you and I were little. I don't think they did. But you have to advocate for yourself. There's a lot of things you can teach children. A lot of them are facts and figures, which turn out to be, common knowledge, but not that useful. But one of them is to learn to think your way through a system or an organization or a community, and to really learn how to get where you need to be. And it sounds like you learned that really, really well. I think you do it beautifully. If that is a talent that Kevin and maybe other people listening have not quite discovered, rather than eliminating this whole possibility because there are a bunch of sourpusses over there, just find a way to avoid the sourpusses.
I think you're right, Stephen. Maybe when we were growing up, the received wisdom was, this is the way system is. You just have to fit into it. So, yeah, I think it's good advice to consider yourself the driver.
Or you could just get high. That's it for today's episode of Freakonomics Radio. You can get all our episodes on any podcast app or come by Freakonomics.com for transcripts and show notes. If you have something to tell us, we are at radio@Freakonomics.com. We'll be back next week. Until then, take care of yourself and, if you can, someone else too.
This is KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, and KQOW Bellingham, Seattle's NPR news station. It's just before 5 o'clock.
Support for KUOW comes from BloodWorks Northwest. BloodWorks is testing February blood donations for COVID-19 antibodies. If found, those blood donations could help COVID patients directly. Information about nearby centers and pop-up drives at bloodworksnw.org.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. A year into the pandemic, your morning routine probably looks a lot different than it used to. But whenever you're finding the time To catch up on the news these days, Seattle Now is here to make it easy to stay informed. We're breaking down the big local stories every weekday in about 10 minutes. Just search for Seattle Now on KUOW.org or your favorite podcast app.
News headlines are headed your way in just about 60 seconds, but I wanted to take a quick look at the weather. Currently 47 degrees in Seattle. For tonight, lows expected to be around 42, and rain is expected for the next 7 days or so.
President Biden declares a disaster in Texas. A deadly winter storm has left millions without safe, reliable drinking water.
We're just trying to do the bare minimum right now. Basically, drinking water and flushing toilets. You can't really do much beyond that.
For Saturday, February 20th, this is All Things Considered. I'm Michelle Martin. Also this hour, what the winter storm tells us about America's energy infrastructure.
This is a huge technological problem, but that problem comes from our value system.
And you can hate if you want to, but we are totally going to talk about the latest dust-up on The Bachelor.
There is still something, however contrived, about the kind of fantasy of being romanced in a spectacular way that allures and also endures.
That's all coming up. But first, this news.
Live from NPR News, I'm Janine Herbst. The record low temperatures in Texas are abating slowly. President Biden today approved a major disaster declaration for the Lone Star State. Authorities say of the 69 deaths attributed to the weather, more than a dozen died in homes that lost heat. Power grid outages left food and water shortages in its wake. Texas Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee says many of the most vulnerable need a lifeline.
We were getting calls from children, adult children, whose parents lived in older homes left behind, that were trying to get them out of the freezing conditions because they thought they might die during the night. That was unacceptable and unnecessary.
Speaking outside the Houston Food Bank today, Jackson Lee says she wants people to know they won't be turned away. President Biden says he hopes to travel to Texas next week. House Democrats are taking a major step forward in pushing President Biden's pandemic relief plan through Congress, with a vote expected to take place next week. NPR's Windsor Johnston reports Democrats have unveiled the details of the nearly $2 trillion measure that includes another round of direct payments and an extension of key supplemental unemployment benefits.
House Democrats are up against a March 14th deadline when extra weekly unemployment benefits are set to expire. The next relief measure includes an extension of those benefits through the end of August. It also provides $1,400 relief checks to eligible Americans, more money for vaccine distribution, and additional federal aid for state and local governments. Democrats have also included a provision that would gradually increase the nation's minimum wage to $15 per hour, a clause that's expected to receive pushback in the Senate from Republicans and some moderate Democrats. The bill needs the support from every Democrat in the Senate to pass with a simple majority. Windsor Johnston, NPR News, Washington.
Mexico's top coronavirus official says he has symptoms of the disease. From member station KJZZ's Mexico City Bureau, Rodrigo Cervantes reports the official has been criticized for not following his own health recommendations.
Hugo López-Gatell is Mexico's Undersecretary of Health, leading the fight against COVID-19 along with the president. On Saturday, López-Gatell tweeted that he has mild symptoms of the virus and that he will continue working from home. López-Gatell has faced criticisms for his policies, arguments, and personal approaches to the pandemic. He once defended the president for not wearing face masks, arguing that he's a source of morality and not of infection. The Undersecretary was recently exposed vacationing in a beach not following health protocols, and he offers press conferences without a face mask. Critics say López-Gatell's pandemic strategy has been exceedingly relaxed, while the vaccination numbers are still very low. For NPR News, I'm Rodrigo Cervantes in Mexico City.
And you're listening to NPR News. Britain is easing up on some lockdown restrictions. Nursing home residents will soon be allowed to have one friend or family member visit them indoors. The change takes effect next month. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he will announce a roadmap out of lockdown on Monday. Officials are investigating a crash that killed 2 near Montgomery, Alabama last night. Troy Public Radio's Kyle Gassett has more.
The crash killed a student pilot who's a member of the Japanese Air Assault Defense Force and a flight instructor, a U.S. Air Force lieutenant. Officials are not releasing many details about the airmen, but Colonel Seth Graham did give their ages 25 and 24.
And the loss of 2 of our teammates is something that affects us all. That said, the strength of our bond is what will help us get through this together.
The cause of the crash is pending investigation. Weather conditions were fair early Friday evening when the plane went down in a wooded area near the Montgomery Airport and residential homes. For NPR News, I'm Kyle Gassett.
Nearly 50 migrants in a small wooden boat were rescued off Italy's coast by the Coast Guard today as the craft capsized in the Mediterranean. The Italian Coast Guard says the migrants were being transferred to the Italian vessels when the boat overturned about 15 miles south of Lampedusa Island. Human traffickers in Libya and Tunisia often launch overcrowded, unseaworthy rubber dinghies and aging fishing boats toward European shores for migrants who are hoping to find family or jobs. I'm Janine Herbst, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the William T. Grant Foundation, working to harness the power of research to make a difference in the lives of children, teens, and young adults for more than 80 years. Learn more at WTGrantFDN.org.
A new Redfin report shows that Seattle has become the most economically integrated city in the nation. That means that in Seattle, more than anywhere else, bosses live near their lower wage employees. Find out how townhomes factor into this. That's a story from reporter Joshua McNichols that can be found online at KUOW.org.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Michelle Martin. We're going to start today with a focus on the ongoing effects from that deadly winter storm that hit several states a few days ago. Earlier today, President Biden approved a major disaster declaration for Texas, which was hit especially hard. The move frees up federal funding to help rebuild and recover from the storm. Throughout the state, freezing temperatures and extreme weather had a devastating effect on infrastructure, especially the water supply, affecting millions of people. Here's Florian Martin of Houston Public Media with the latest on that.
Volunteers handed out thousands of bottles of water at a distribution site in San Antonio.
It's been challenging because we have 5 people.
Michael Williams came here from the small town of Bernie, just outside San Antonio. He says he and his family have been without running water since Monday.
Our community in Bernie has really banded together, so it's challenging, but we can get through it.
After days without electricity, the vast majority of Texans have had their power restored, according to the state's grid manager. Temperatures are back to above freezing in most of the state, but clean water could remain an issue through the rest of the weekend and beyond. The problem is low water pressure.
We've seen a cascade of effects.
Harris County Judge Lina Hidalgo is the chief executive for the county that includes Houston.
The power outages affected the generators that keep the pressure going, and the pipes that have burst have also been a problem for that, leading to the loss of water pressure.
When the pressure sinks below a certain level, Texas cities are required to issue boil water notices because the water could become contaminated. Notices are in effect in large cities like Houston, Austin, and San Antonio. This week, many people ran their faucets on a constant trickle, something plumbers advise to keep pipes from freezing.
Well, it's a catch-22.
John Ingram is a plumber in Houston.
Yes, it does take away water, and we are in a crisis as far as water pressure and keeping the pressure up across the city. However, at the same time, that's really the only option you have in maintaining water in your home.
Thanks to all those burst pipes, demand for plumbers now far exceeds supply. One Houston church has reached out to partners across the country to get volunteer plumbers to Texas. Chris C. is the pastor at Ecclesia Houston. He says they usually try to organize emergency help like this for home repairs after tropical storms and hurricanes.
This time we need a little bit more skilled labor. Mucking houses is a lot easier than plumbing repairs and burst pipes, but just following in that vein, we know that's what we need.
C says the response has been slow as other states have also had issues with the weather and people are hesitant to travel during the pandemic. But he's confident they'll get a team of volunteers together for the communities most in need. The church is paying for travel, food, and accommodation. For most Texans, the nightmare will probably be over next week, but many others will have to deal with the storm's aftermath for a while longer.
We went outside and our neighbors have kind of been checking on each other, and it was the same for everyone.
Rachel Finken lives in Austin, where large areas are still without water.
We're just trying to do the bare minimum right now. Basically, drinking water and flushing toilets. We can't really do much beyond that.
She says they've even had to collect snow from outside to melt in the tub. For NPR News, I'm Florian Martin in Houston.
The storm in Texas highlights just how fragile U.S. infrastructure can be. And so you might wonder if this problem extends beyond Texas. It does. In their most recent report card, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave the U.S. energy infrastructure a D+, stating, quote, without greater attention to aging equipment, capacity bottlenecks, and increased demand, as well as increasing storm and climate impacts, Americans will likely experience longer and more frequent power interruptions, unquote. We wanted to learn more about this, so we called Gretchen Bakke. She is the author of The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future, which examines the history of electrical power and its current challenges. When we spoke earlier today, she explained the problems in Texas are partly due to its independence from the U.S. power grid.
With Texas, because they are not connected, because they're making their own electricity for themselves, they've had all of this freedom, right? But at the same time, that means that they've had no oversight, and there's a very fierce market, right, that's happening there too. So there's been a lot of worry or a lot of attention paid to how to make money in this very tiny, Texas is big, but not compared to like the West Coast power grid. So within this tiny kind of electricity community, not that much money is being put into infrastructure, into very simple things that we know we need, which is like a little jacket, for example, that you put on an instrumentation panel which stays outside, right? So you don't expect the natural gas pipelines to freeze in Texas, right? This is another problem. You don't expect a coal pile to freeze solid so that you can't get the coal into your power plant. You don't expect your wind turbines not to work. But all of these things are merely slight changes or more care taken to the upkeep of the actual physical infrastructure that then is compounded by the fact that you can't actually import electricity into Texas. Not all of Texas, but the parts which have lost power.
So what is the broader lesson here? What needs to happen now with the U.S. electric grid? I mean, what should we be thinking about now?
There's two different things that need to happen to the electric grid right now. The first is what's called hardening, and this is what we're talking about in Texas, where you just sort of spend a little bit of time and attention figuring out what you need to do in this particular place in order to make the system as it is more resilient, right? You need to put a little jacket on your instrumentation panels. And secondarily, we need to be doing something else, which is thinking about how it is we can run an electricity system on renewable resources or carbon-free resources, since nuclear really, in some parts of the country, is really a backbone to the electricity system. But it wasn't the wind turbines that were the problem in Texas. It wasn't the solar really that was a problem in Texas. And that kind of grid, reimagining electricity that's being made and moves differently and is used differently, that will give you actually the possibility to say things like, what happens if in Austin people had solar panels on their roofs and were allowed to use that electricity to keep their own power on? Because now in the U.S., you have to feed solar power back into the bigger grid. And so there's a very slight changes of thinking, and I think that's what actually matters. So to harden the grid, yes, but also to think we're in the 21st century, like think about how we can do the whole thing better. not by tearing it out, but by slowly integrating, changing, rethinking, reimagining what the world could be like without actually depending on the things, the fossil fuels. We love them. We've built the grid to work with them. We've built the economy to work with them, right? But that's what's causing these kinds of weird weather events.
I think most of us outside of Texas were wondering, like, why it is that the governor of Texas immediately went on one of the conservative, talk shows to defend fossil fuels and to criticize renewables. And a lot of us sort of found that puzzling, since a fraction of the energy sourcing in Texas is from renewables. And I take your point that it's a leader in that. In fact, they have a sort of a greater percentage than other places. But why was there this rush to criticize renewables? It just seems strange to us. Can you explain that?
There is something going on that relates conservative politics to what President Trump had called our kind of fuel, our kind of power. And there's a conservatism to this very material, historical, known, reliable energy source that we command. So the idea that you can rely upon fossil fuels, that fossil fuels are they're sort of the safety blanket, and that the incoming or the risky thing is this variable renewable power sources. And by variable, I mean you can't turn up a wind turbine, right? Because it's running at the speed of the wind. So if it's running at maximum, it's the speed of the wind. You can turn up, if your pipeline isn't frozen, you can turn up natural gas. If your pile of coal isn't frozen, you can turn up your coal-burning power plant. And that means that it's us deciding, not nature deciding. And there's something very, very sure feeling about that, that maps on in some sort of strange way to a set of political persuasions. So it's not all many Republicans are for especially solar power because it allows for a kind of independence and self-sufficiency, right? It's not divided merely on party lines. But in this moment, it was not surprising that there was this sort of point to the, here's the danger. It's the thing we can't control, right? The thing we can't control is the danger.
So it's interesting. It's not necessarily the fundamentals. It's how people feel about it.
Exactly. I'm an anthropologist, right? So I'm not an electrical engineer writing about the electric power grid. And it aligned as it was designed and as we've changed it over the past 120 years, it aligns absolutely to the particularity of American values, business values, and also cultural values over time. We're always changing this infrastructure. We're always intervening in it. And now we're saying, let's make power renewably. Oh dear, right? Like this is a huge technological problem, but that problem comes from our value system.
That is Gretchen Baki. She teaches anthropology at Humboldt University in Berlin. She's the author of The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future. Professor Baki, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on.
Shelby? Coming up tomorrow on Weekend Edition, more time looking at our screens during this pandemic means more people are suffering from something called digital eye strain. That's when your eyes get tired and dry from too much staring at your devices. One recommended source of relief, blue light blocking glasses, but are they really effective? Listen for that tomorrow. Just ask your smart speaker to play NPR or your station by name.
Hey, get out!
You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News.
Support comes from Dubois Carey Law Group, divorce attorneys with offices in Seattle and Bellevue.
Since the January 6th, I have recommitted to stopping another moment to think, how am I reacting and why am I reacting this way?
The Rebuilding Democracy series heads east again for more on the Cascade Divide. On Speakers Forum, Sunday night at 7, or streaming and podcasting now at KUOW.org.
Carter Subaru supports KUOW's car donation program.
Hi, it's Ross Reynolds, executive producer for community engagement at KUOW. The thought of getting rid of a vehicle you love can be bittersweet. Well, now you can give your old vehicle new life by donating it to KUOW. Keep the programming you love alive and well with a tax-deductible donation of your car, truck, or RV. For details, call 1-866-KUOW-CAR.
The KUOW car donation program is powered by Carter Subaru in Ballard, Shoreline, and at cartersubaru.com.
News headlines are next. It's 5:19.
I'm Janine Herbst with these headlines. In Myanmar, at least 2 protesters were killed, several others injured in demonstrations in Mandalay against the military coup. They also called for the release of elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi. The U.S., Britain, Canada, and New Zealand announced limited sanctions on the country. Russia opposition leader Alexei Navalny lost his appeal of the nearly 3-year prison sentence for violating the terms of his probation, but a court did reduce that sentence by 6 weeks, taking into account the time he spent under house arrest in 2015. And in Israel, hundreds of volunteers are helping to clean up the shoreline from an oil spill that threatens wildlife and the beach. The cause of that spill is under investigation. I'm Janine Herbst, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Cigna, a global health service company dedicated to helping people improve their health, well-being, and peace of mind. More information is available at Cigna.com. From the Vital Projects Fund, supporting the Museum of Modern Art. MoMA's film programs are now streaming on Virtual Cinema, a world of global cinema hand-picked by curators. Learn more at MoMA.org. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Michelle Martin. The economic devastation caused by the coronavirus pandemic has not been limited to any one country or even continent. It is global. And recovering from that is a top priority for the next Director General of the World Trade Organization. Economist Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala served twice as the finance minister of Nigeria and had a long career at the World Bank here in Washington, D.C., where she rose to the number 2 position as managing director. And in just a few days, on March 1st, she will become the first woman and the first African to lead the World Trade Organization. That is the body that was created in 1995 to help settle trade disputes, write new trade rules, and encourage the worldwide flow of goods and services. And even though most people may not really know how the WTO works, its influence on the global economy is vast. And Director General-elect Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is with us now. Welcome and congratulations, or is it condolences? This is a very difficult time to be taking on this position.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for having me. I think it's both congratulations and commiserations at the same time. It's going to be a tough challenge.
So as we said, this is a time of global economic disarray, largely because of the pandemic, although, of course, there were sort of underlying issues before that. How would you describe the damage done by the pandemic to global trade?
I would say that it's huge, considerable. Global trade dropped precipitously in 2020, last year. And although it's now being projected to rebound this year, there is no doubt that with the global economy shrinking, as a matter of fact, projections by the IMF for last year was a shrinkage of slightly more than 4% for the global economy. And so global trade goes along with that. You know, global trade is 60% of the global economy. So when that shrinks, it has a huge impact on trade as well.
And do you feel that your organization, to be with the WTO, can influence this issue? I mean, in the short term.
I believe so, Michelle. I think in a very big way on the public health side, because until we solve the public health issues of the pandemic, we can't really get the economic issues settled. I think that is very clear. And how can the WTO help? Well, when people think of vaccines, when they think of therapeutics and diagnostics, these are also traded goods. And to the extent that countries or WTO members have export restrictions or even prohibitions on the exports of these goods, this helps hold back the recovery. So trying to use the rules to monitor strongly and encourage members to drop these restrictions is very important. Up to 100 members still have them. So I believe the WTO can contribute strongly by trying to get these rules dropped, encouraging a freer flow of goods, helping to exercise the needed flexibilities to encourage more manufacture of vaccines all over the world. I think these are ways to help.
And of course, this is an immediate and serious crisis, both the health crisis and the economic crisis that is connected to it. But even apart from that, there seems to be wide agreement that the WTO needs urgent reforms. I mean, even, the former U.S. president, obviously expressed himself in a very belligerent, manner that many people found offensive. But he isn't the only one to think that China has been using unfair trade practices and that the WTO's effectiveness as a trade regulating body, I think many analysts would say, has been weakened in the face of rising nationalism and protectionism, all over the world. And I just wanted to ask, first of all, do you agree with the critique? And secondly, what are your priorities in reforming the organization?
I agree with the critique that the WTO needs reforms. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I had said in my campaign that it cannot be business as usual. And first and foremost, I've talked about the top priority for me is seeing how the rules can be looked at so that we can help contribute to a solution of this pandemic, both on the health and economic side. The second area we need to look at is the dispute settlement system. You alluded to it. The WTO has the only place in the entire world where countries can bring disputes, trade disputes they have with each other and have them looked at and settled. So we need to reform this. It's been paralyzed. There's no point making new rules if the place where rules can be settled, where disputes can be settled, is not working. I think the third aspect is that the WTO has fallen behind in its rulemaking. We need to update rules to 21st century realities. I'll just give you an example. This pandemic has heightened the issue of the digital economy, and e-commerce is booming. And there are no rules right now that underpin e-commerce. There is a set of negotiations going on among members on e-commerce. So the sooner we expand those negotiations and finalize them and come to rules that can really help underpin trade, so it is fair, there's a level playing field, it's balanced, both poor and rich countries can have access. I think these are some of the areas where I think there are top priorities to take action.
I just want to turn around just for the last couple of minutes we have to you. I mean, there are so many firsts in your resume. You are the first woman to serve as finance minister and foreign minister in Nigeria. You will be the first woman and the first African to lead the WTO. I noticed in looking at your Twitter feed, just you were receiving congratulations from, top women economic leaders all over the world, but also for want of a better word, civilians. I mean, people who would say small business owners, and all over the world. And I just wonder how that sits with you. Is that feels like a lot to carry?
Michelle, you're absolutely right. First of all, I really feel humble, and I don't say that mildly. Humble and honored to have this kind of wave of recognition and support. My sincere hope is that we open the door so that in future women will just go into these jobs and it will not create as much noise or waves as it has. Second, it does carry a sense of responsibility. When people are looking to you and you're in such a public place to do better. But I've been there before. I'm focused on delivering results because I felt that, look, this is what I have to do to make clear that we shouldn't think twice about bringing women into these jobs. And my pride and joy is that since I was finance minister, 3 more women have been made finance minister in Nigeria. So it's no longer, actually, it's now become the thing, not only in Nigeria, but on the continent, to have women running finance. Similarly, for this job, I hope to double down, produce results. It's going to be infinitely, of course, more challenging than being at home. But of course, I hope to use some of the same lessons, because being finance minister was not an easy job at all. But Michelle, I want to say something. I'm not going to let this weigh me down. If you wake up in the morning thinking, oh my God, I have these huge responsibilities, then you become paralyzed. I'm just going to focus on how can I get results, how can I get people together to produce for the global economy, and above all, how can I also see that the WTO serves poor countries so that they can also benefit from the multilateral trading system.
That is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, soon to be the new Director General of the World Trade Organization. Director General-elect, thank you so much for speaking with us today, and I do hope we'll speak again.
Thank you, Michelle. Look forward. It's always a joy to hear from you. Take care.
Get the fuck up, boy.
A new film called Nomadland offers a glimpse into the lives of older Americans who move into their vehicles, mainly for economic reasons, but who also embrace it, or at least choose to see it as a way of life. The film is a work of fiction, but as NPR's Alexi Horowitz-Ghazi reports, its director borrows from the world of documentary to tell the story.
When we first meet Fern, the 60-something protagonist of Nomadland, played by Frances McDormand, her life is in flux.
My mom says that you're homeless. Is that true?
No, I'm not homeless. I'm just houseless. Not the same thing, right?
No.
Don't worry about me. I'm okay.
After the death of her husband and the economic collapse of the Nevada mining town where she lives, she's moved into a white Ford Econoline van, nicknamed Vanguard, which holds her few precious possessions. She meanders through a series of vast, beautiful, and at times brutal landscapes around the West in search of work.
So when do you need to get back to work? Now? I need work. I like work. I'm not sure exactly what you would be eligible for.
She picks up shifts at an Amazon fulfillment center, as a campground host in the South Dakota Badlands, and harvesting beets in the fields of Nebraska. At each stop, Fern meets other nomads, middle-aged and older Americans who found themselves trudging the same road.
I was getting close to 62, and I went online to look at my Social Security benefit. It said $550. Fern, I had worked my whole life. I'd worked since I was 12 years old, raised 2 daughters. I couldn't believe it.
Based on the 2017 nonfiction book Nomadland by journalist Jessica Bruder, the film features a cast of mostly non-actors, real-life nomads like Linda May, who you just heard, telling the real stories of their life within the frame of a fictional film. And that blending of fact and fiction is a signature technique of the film's director, Chloe Zhao.
I think I'm looking for some kind of truth. I'm looking for some kind of authentic moments.
Zhao's films have been called modern westerns, but Zhao says she didn't actually see those films growing up in Beijing, and her interest in the western landscape came later, around the end of film school at NYU. When she saw a series of National Geographic photos of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, she knew she wanted to make her first film there.
There was such an American message and identity, these images, how the clash between the old and the new. Seeing a Lakota boy on bareback on a horse at a gas station, and he's wearing a Tupac t-shirt. It's very special, so that's how I first went there.
Zhao planned a more traditional fiction film, working from a screenplay with professional actors, but when her funding fell through, she created a cinematic style that fit her budget. She centered her first film, 2015's Songs My Brothers Taught Me, around non-actors, building trust with their subjects to weave the details of their personal lives into the story. Her next film, The Rider, which premiered at Cannes in 2017, built on the same technique, telling the lightly fictionalized story of a young rodeo rider struggling to find a new sense of identity after a traumatic brain injury leaves him unable to ride. It won accolades at Cannes and the Toronto International Film Festival, where senior director Diana Sanchez says it had audiences, including herself, in tears.
You get so close to her characters. So I think it's that intimacy she's able to achieve that just really touched a chord in people.
It was also at Toronto that Frances McDormand, who'd optioned the film rights to Nomadland, saw Chloe Zhao's work for the first time. As she told an audience at a screening last year, McDormand didn't know how the book would translate to the screen. But when she discovered Zhao's films, she knew she'd found the right creative partner.
Not being a writer or a director, I couldn't imagine it. But I had seen the writer, so I knew she could.
And McDormand says Zhao brought her signature approach to this film.
Chloe and I talked a lot about my own desire to live on the road. I told my husband that when I turned 65, I was going to change my name to Fern, start smoking Lucky Strikes, drinking Wild Turkey, and I'd hit the road in my RV.
They traversed the country in vans for months, meeting real-life nomads and incorporating their experiences into the film.
I just deeply admire her as a storyteller.
Bob Wells is a central figure in the real-life nomad community and plays himself in the film. He says that Zhao's organic approach to filmmaking was a bit mysterious at times.
I never knew what the story was. I think I watched the story evolve as we shot.